Thanks very much indeed, Alec, for taking us through that and setting the scene. Now, I'd like to welcome up our other panellists, so please do join us up here, and I'll introduce you, because each of them is just going to give you a couple of minutes each. Good, thank you. Just introducing them on down the line. Next to Alec is Richard Hills, Councillor. Next to Richard is Rachel Brown from the Sustainable Business Network, and next to Rachel is Johnnie Freeland from Ngāti Te Ato Waihua, and next to Johnnie is Tahuia Taylor, Director of Pakorua Consulting. I'll tell you more about each of them as they get up to talk. First of all, a very big hand for them all, because it's wonderful to have them here. Thank you. So I'm going to turn first to Richard, and Richard is chair of the Environment and Climate Change Committee, and therefore in Council he's leading the response on climate change with this plan in hand. He's a second-term councillor, and he was the second, when he first joined the council, he was the second youngest councillor in Auckland Council history, and he's the council's first rainbow councillor. So a whole bunch of seconds and firsts in there as well. It's wonderful. And so Richard's other priorities on council include people, public transport, in addition to youth, mental health and the environment, and of course climate change. So Richard, over to you. And we've asked each of the panelists to give us a couple of minutes, a bit about themselves, a bit about their work as they focus on these climate issues. So Richard, over to you.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko taratara te maunga, ko whangaroa te moana, no Glenfield Ho, ko Richard Hills toko ingoa, ko Ngāpuhi toko iwi, he kai konehera o Tāmaki Makaurau. So kia ora everyone, I'm Richard Hills, and yes, I just first want to give a couple of acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge mana whenua, especially the 19 mana whenua who have been involved from the beginning of this this plan, and I want to acknowledge our staff. So Alec and the team, have done an amazing amount of work over a very long time before I was the chair of this committee as well. And also just want to acknowledge our wider council whānau. We had a very tragic death last week of a staff member, and unfortunately a member of our leisure team this in a similar way this week. So it's been a very difficult time for our council whānau, and the stress and strain of what's been going on with the emergency budget and things. So I just want to, I know that council doesn't get a lot of positive awhi out there a lot of the time, but they are doing extremely amazing work under a lot of pressure and cuts and redundancies and things like that, and I know that those decisions mean a lot to people. So sorry to bring the tone there, but I thought it was important to acknowledge those members and their families, and also our staff, and acknowledge all of you here today and everyone doing the mahi for a very long time on climate. It feels like we are moving forward fast, and unfortunately COVID feels like it put a bit of a handbrake on the excitingness that I felt like we were moving, but I think we are still moving very well in the right direction. So I said to the Mayor when we got re-elected, that was quite nice, in November last year, that we really, I would like a senior role or a leadership role in the council. He accepted that request, but I also suggested that we needed a very strong climate committee, and he believed in that too. So thankfully, Councillor Coombe and I, Chair and Deputy Chair of this Environment and Climate Change Committee, the first time we've had a committee of the whole with climate as the focus, to shepherd this through. I mean, as many of you in this room probably think that should have been happening a long time ago, but we've had a lot of things on this year, but I think Te Tārakia Tāwhiri has been the number one thing we've been working on with our communities, and the results of that, and the strength, and the fact that we got unanimous support from councillors in March for halving Auckland's emissions by 2030. Then we got unanimous support again in July, so what I've been reminding our colleagues was after COVID had hit, we also got unanimous support for the plan. Thank you to Alec and the team and everyone behind that. Now the rubber shouldn't be hitting the road, I guess, in a way. That the money where the mouth is the difficult part now. We're not starting from nowhere. We have billions of dollars on things like public transport, the massive amount of investment in our healthy waters and stormwater and different ways of doing things in council the last 10 years, I think has been pretty phenomenal, and that's going forward. But we now also have to drive through the mayoral proposal and what we need to be doing in reducing our council emissions, but also working towards the partnership with our community to reduce emissions and plan for that never-ending destruction climate change is doing to Tāmaki, so how we can protect it along the way is key. So thank you very much, and I probably talked way too long, but thank you.
That was just great, thank you. And it's really exciting. It is a committee of the whole council on this. I'd be very distressed if not all councillors are engaged, so that's structurally a very good response. Thank you. Rachel is well known to you all as the founder and chief executive of the Sustainable Business Network, and in that work for some 20 years now. Rachel also sits on various bodies such as Jobs for Nature Advisory Panel and the National Waste and Resource Advisory Group. So Rachel, a couple of minutes for you on you and your work on all this.
Kia ora. Can you guys hear me okay? I'm going to start with a little welcome, just to settle us into the room for me. Te whare atu nei, tēnā koe. Te papa I waho, tēnā koe. E ngā mati haere, haere, haere. Ki te whānau I hui hui nei. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I'm sure you guys know what I just said, but I was basically just making sure we were present in the room, thinking of what's going outside and the whenua outside of the room, welcoming you all here. And this is new to me, but I think it's really important for all of us who are Kiwis and part of Aotearoa to embrace this as the way we be. So yes, I set up SBN a long time ago when I had brown hair, and now it's grey. And I've been feeling urgent about climate since then. And there has been many times where the frustration levels have really grown in that time. And I'll share a little bit about that, I'm sure, as we go. And partly the frustration is there are a lot of people wanting to be in this space, and there's not a lot of permission or enough permission for us to actually work together. So I really embrace what you said, Alec Tang. So the first points I want to make is the first thing is this is a systemic failing. The fact that climate change is even happening is a sign of the fact that we do not live with nature properly. This is a human cock-up, and we could have done this better, but we haven't got to that point of no return yet, so we can turn that around, which is really positive. So we're not in a bad place, we're in a good place, but we really need to get behind it and make it work. I work with business, which is crazy because I was brought up by a family who were really staunchly anti-business. They were a bunch of greenies. They used to go around and do sediment sampling in mangrove swamps to tell the council not to build motorways through mangrove swamps. So that's my history of learning. Now I work with business because when I looked at who was going to move the fastest, I could see that business had the capacity to move really fast as long as the system supported them to do it and as long as we got behind the good actions that they were going to have. We know there's some businesses out there doing some good stuff. Climate Leaders is trying to do some things. We're trying to work with some amazing SMEs that are doing some really great solution sets like, you know, EV public use car sharing schemes. But New Zealand's addicted to ownership. So we don't want to get rid of our cars. They're a status symbol. There's a bunch of problems with the way that we currently are as humans with these kind of solution sets that are coming through. The other thing is that these guys are still small in number, and we need to make this a mass movement. We all need to make this a mass movement. And at the moment, it's really hard to be at the spiky end of change. It's really hard. So the kind of folks who do it put a lot of personal time and energy and have to try and bust through those barriers. It's really tricky. Council, government council did their climate emergency a year ago, and the Prime Minister has just given climate emergency for our nation. Wow, that's really cool. Now, where is the real policy and investment behind that? Because business desperately needs this for us to mainstream and make this stuff something that we all do on a daily behaviour. So really welcome that. I would love to have thought the work that we were doing on Build Back Better wasn't about shovel-ready projects, but I was really pleased to see Jobs for Nature take a shape. But I think we've got a lot of learning to do in this moment. So I really welcome the fact that these things are coming, but I'm really hopeful that we're going to do it properly. We learned so much from COVID. COVID came through and we learned how to Zoom. We learned how to have an awards event in 5 parts around the country, and instead of flying everyone to one central event, we could do it right across the country. We've learned a lot through COVID. The risk is we're going to shift back into those old behaviours and patterns, which we're already doing quite quickly, and we need to really start to work out how to make sure we don't have an unfair social system as we move into this new low-carbon, circular, regenerative future that we're all aiming for. I think there's a lot of things to learn from COVID in terms of the communication that the government have been leading on. I think they've done a fabulous job. I would love us to do that same kind of energy on climate. So that's why I'm here, and I'm looking forward to a conversation amongst these guys. But thank you for attending.
Thank you very much indeed, Rachel. And now it's a great pleasure to introduce Johnnie Freeland. As I said, Johnny's of Ngāti Ata Waioha and Ngaituhoi descent. And Johnny's played a really important role in this work by helping navigate a whakapapa-centred response to climate change through the Mana Whenua Kaitiaki Forum. And one of the things that leapt out of Alex's discussion at the beginning about the plan was how this was sort of ecologically based response. So we're trying to understand how we humans can play our role in ecosystems to bring about the right response here. So in partnering with the Auckland Council together, they're looking to harness the benefits of drawing on Mātauranga Māori knowledge and Western science together to navigate a way forward for Auckland through the climate plan. So Johnny, over to you, please. Thank you.
Ka tū tēnei ki te mihi ki a tātou i te ahihari pō, e mihi kauna ki te whare nei me te whenua, pēnā maunga whakahi a rimutahi, me te wai o horetu I rere nei ki te Waitamata, mēnā iwi kāinga o te wahi nei a Ngāti Pātua, te wai o hua, nō reira tēnei te mihi kia a tātou, kia koutou. I mihi kia ona kia koe I te tuahi, I whakamauhara, aku whakaaro ki tō māma I pane te mahi kei wainui a tātou, nō reira tēnā, me te taumata nei tēnā tātou. Kia ora everybody, I just sort of did the Māori GPS thing and helping locate myself into this landscape and acknowledging there's a place up on the corner of Ponsonby Road and K Road, and we refer to it as Rimutahi, and it's the highest point in the ridgeline. And then acknowledge that we sit in the flow of the Horotu Creek that now runs in the pipelines down the middle of Queen Street out to the Waitamata Harbour, and acknowledging the sort of our indigenous whānau of this place in terms of Ngāti Pātua and Te Waipo, so, and acknowledging all of us. So I'll sit down here. But certainly from, I guess, it's really hard to describe my role or what I do, because I do what our elders sort of say, and they set the task and we go and do the work. But I guess I describe myself as a systems navigator, and from a deep Māori systems thinking, and also in a Western systems thinking, and try to navigate between those two spaces. And in terms of the kōrero around the systems failure, that's how we see it, is that we as humans have failed our mother papa tūnaku. And so it requires quite a distinct response, and understanding context for us as Māori is that we've sat in this landscape of tamaki makaurau for over 1,000 years. And there was a time where those whakapapa systems thrived, and then over the last 180 years we've seen a diminishing of that whakapapa system to the point we're in survival mode. And COVID really brought a sharp focus on that. And not only the state of our people, but the state of our systems. And COVID's been an invitation by Papa Tunuku to initiate a pivot, to bring into sharp focus not only the challenges, but the opportunity to sort of shift our trajectory. And one of the things that through Te Tarukia Tāwhiri is that in the courage of Auckland Council being a square system, is then invited a circle system to explore a pathway together. And not in a RMA consultation engagement, but in actually co-partnering. And one of the things we talked about in one of the early previous council term was, let's not make climate be an issue for ethnicity. Because every other issue, Māori's sort of been subjugated as a group stakeholder to consult. Not let's actually co-navigate the space of uncertainty. Because what we bring, despite the impacts of squareisation, and what you see is all the negative statistics of disconnected and displaced whakapapa, over-representation in the state system of care, overpopulation in prison, and this poverty, because we never lived like that, we become like that over generations. So again, understanding context. And then location. So how do we locate it to this place called Tamaki Makaurau? And the uniqueness of the whakapapa system, which we're all part of, in terms of Tamaki Makaurau. So that was sort of the exciting proposition, and I really want to acknowledge Richard and Pippa and Alec to sort of take on that journey and allowing a mana whenua-led, a mana whenua underpin approach to where we led our conversations across not only mana whenua but our youth and our Māori communities, and supported the co-navigation to where we've got this framing around this concept of te tarukia tāwhiri. So it's more than just a nice Māori story. There's a Da Vinci Code in Māori narratives that unlock those connections. So what we're sort of talking about is how do we restore the balance in terms of those symbiotic relationships between people, place and nature. And those ecosystems of whakapapa and how we sit in that as humans. That's the exciting element, because so COVID, climate is an opportunity, and it's only one issue for Māori, because we've had to respond to COVID, we've had to respond to find our way out of the impacts of colonisation, poverty and all those things. So this is just another issue in the context of our whakapapa. You know, so while climate's an issue, it's not the kaupapa, it's not the, you know, so that's why we talk about te ora o tamaki makaurau. So this is ultimately about well-being and the balance of well-being between people, place and nature. COVID's another, climate's an opportunity for us to recalibrate and to reframe. And so we talk about how do we reimagine, reframe and reset the system. So one of the challenges, you know, having to go through some of the square things in council, and I think from a community perspective, we all witness the square, you know, whether we call it bureaucracy or whatever, but it's part of it's still locked in the square system, and really want to acknowledge part of the thinking to try and deal with this emergency budget. But in a lot of ways, and because of the current system, is we're using pre-COVID thinking to try and imagine a post-COVID world. When we've got to really start to reframe and reimagine what that post-COVID, and we sort of plan backwards, not trying to do this adaptive thinking for a future, because it's a current state to a future state where we don't really acknowledge the past in that sense. So we're really excited to be part of the kōrero, part of the support, and for us, it's really about how do we fulfill our obligations and responsibilities as mana whenua? Not just about asserting our rights and interests in a legal sense, in a treaty sense or whatever. That's all about square behaviour. So the challenge is also for Māori and how we've been entrapped in the square ourselves and actually find our way back to the wholeness of our circle. And the last sort of point, sort of want to make on the front. That this is about papa tunuku anchored and wahine led in terms of our response. Because the square is anchored on individualism and patriarchal thinking. So we've done that way. And that's the 200 years experience of Aotearoa, which is on the back of 500 years of industrial revolution, where we've gone from circle to square. And so in that context, it's really about honouring papa tunuku and her relationship with rangi nui, so there's balance. But for our wahine, who represent our whare tangata, so they're literally the holders of our future generations. So as a wahine, when you give birth to a daughter, you also give birth to your granddaughter at the same time, or your other future generations. So that sort of thinking when we think about papa tunuku anchored and wahine led. And the role of tāne is how we wrap around to tautoko and support and play our role. So that sort of more that deeper systems shift that we are advocating, celebrating, and really wanting to allow that. And this is something happening in a global sense when people are starting to recognise the value of indigenous wisdom, to then how we start to weave that together to co-navigate this time of uncertainty. And just imagine for our whānau in South Auckland that live a life of uncertainty when those systems around them impact on and entrap them in some of that space. So COVID for us and this work around Te Taruki is a real exciting opportunity for us as the people of Tamaki Makaurau as a whole start to work in that way. So kia ora.
Thank you very much indeed, Johnny, for all of that, but inviting us all in to co-navigate with you on this journey. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Tahuia Taylor, who's Director of Pakoroa Consultants. I asked Tahuia earlier what Pakoroa is, and it's a short-tailed stingray that lives in the Manukau Harbour. So I think that's make of that what you will. But I think that sort of identification of self and work with a fabulous creature like that speaks for itself. And most of Tahuia's job experience has been around social enterprise with a focus on better outcomes for Māori and the environment. And over the past few years, she's been growing a big passion for Indigenous knowledge and how that should be a part of the solutions to all of these issues. And that's how she came to establish her consultancy in 2019. So a very warm welcome to you, Tahuia, and over to you.
Well, tēnā koe, Rod. Nau I whakatau I a mātou I roto I tēnei o ngā whare, no re mihi ana ki a koe, Rod. E mihi hoki ana ki ngā puna mātauranga e noho nei. Mā koutou e nei kōrero e whakamana. Ki a tātou katoa kua, whai wā ki te aro ki tēnei kaupapa hirahira tēnei te mihi. I konei ka whakawaha au I te tihi kōrero o Kingi Tāwhiao. E kore tēnei whakaoranga e huri ki tua o aku mokopuna. So just then I quoted the second Māori king, Kingi Tāwhiao, who said, e kore tēnei whakaoranga e huri ki tua o aku mokopuna, which means this regeneration and this revitalization will not go beyond my grandchildren. That is exactly what I am committed to doing in terms of climate change and the betterment of our taiao and our people. I get emotional speaking about this because I've seen my grandparents commit their lives to kaupapa and they didn't get to see the outcomes that they wanted to see, even though they committed their entire lives to that. And so as their mokopuna, as their uri, it is my responsibility to continue that work and to do whatever I can to support the outcomes that they visioned for their tamarikia mokopuna and that I envision for my own tamarikia mokopuna. So I'm privileged to be here and to be sitting here today with you all. And with that in mind, the opportunity that came up with the CSO to help give space to a unique unapologetic rangatahi voice within this climate plan. I jumped on board as soon as I could. I'm really privileged that some of those rangatahi are in the room today. It has been amazing working alongside them, their willingness and their wanting to, be bold, challenge everybody's way of thinking, but also taking guidance from their kaumātua, from mana whenua, knowing that that's just as important in the pursuit of the change that we need to see. That's kind of what I'm here to do, is to be that bold rangatahi voice and to challenge kind of the systems that we are currently living in, and to challenge that, incremental changes are not going to result in the changes that we need to see, and are not going to mean that my mokopuna aren't going to have to continue to fight the same fight as I have to. So that's why I'm here. I was given the opportunity last week. I wasn't actually supposed to be on this panel, but last week I got the call up and I was like, yep, don't know what I'm saying yes to, but with my mokopuna in mind, I have to take this opportunity and to be the voice that I need to be. Nō reira tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you very much to Huia for that huge commitment back to your grandparents, but also looking forward to your mokopuna down through the generations to come. Let's do a couple of show of hands on some things, just picking up on a couple of points that have arisen in our discussion so far. In terms of Te Ao Māori, this worldview, over the last couple of years, how many of us have felt ourselves being awakened to and being to that worldview and taking an interest in it and beginning to engage in it, in terms of how it's started to change your own thinking? I'm just very curious as to, that's thank you. That's wonderful. And I would love to know what it might have looked like online with lots of people looking at their screens, I hope, raising their hand. Just from an observation I'd make very briefly on that, I've seen this very powerfully in the National Science Challenges, where very improbably it was a National Party Science Minister of Research, Science and Technology, Wayne Mapp, who wrote in to the National Science Challenges that deep commitment to Mataranga Māori. And I'm seeing it in working through in a couple of the National Science Challenges, most particular Our Land and Water, but then fascinatingly in one for science, for technology and innovation. And I think it's immensely powerful. That it just feels very right that this is the way we are approaching our view of how we approach our great challenges in Tamaki Makaurau. So the second thing is COVID has changed a very great deal. Who feels that because of COVID, you've made some sort of positive change in your life, in the way you do things or the way you think about things? That who feels some sense of change for the positive in that? That's good, thank you. And again, I wish I could see the hands on screen as well. Obviously a tough question, because many people, even here in Auckland and in New Zealand, have had it hard, very hard, through these months since March. It's not over yet. There's still a lot to adjust to. There is a chance of COVID coming back in various ways. So, moving on to some questions, can I ask particularly, if I may, of Alec and Richard and Johnnie, because you and to Huia, as this plan evolved, was there some discussion about putting an additional framework in there, such as, for example, the donut economy, where the environmental, the ecosystem limits and the social flaw are so beautifully articulated by Kate Rayworth in that work. Was there some thought about having a framework like that that would help us sort of organise ourselves around these people and natural world issues.
Yeah, look, if I just jump in, and I'm looking at Perrin here, who's smiling at me, and I think we've had this debate many times. So Perrin, who some of you may know, with Sierra sat next to her, with the chief architects of this place. I'm the fraud who sits up here and talks a lot. These are the guys that are the brains behind it. And Perrin led a lot of that economic side of things, and is at Auckland Unlimited. Looking at that. And we had a discussion this morning with the Thriving Cities Initiative about how do we do this for Tāmaki Makaurau. You'll see in the plan there is very distinctly in the economy section talk about how do we embed these regenerative models into our way of approaching things like this Economic Development Action Plan that is currently in development, the recovery from COVID, to make sure, and these guys have talked about it a lot in terms of, our response to climate change isn't just about reducing our emissions or preparing for these impacts. It is a fundamental shift that we need to take that says, actually, the way that we've done things before, it just externalized a whole bunch of stuff. And now we're seeing the impacts of doing that, and we cannot continue to do it in that way. That we do need to think about whichever way you want to look at it. And I know that there's been lots of work that Johnnie has been involved in about like reframing the donut for a Te Ao Māori context. And how does that look? Because the principles are great. The principles are basically, we've got a finite planet. We cannot keep consuming on this finite planet. We also have a social context of, how do we increase well-being of our people, and how do we do that with each of those in mind, and that we don't just think about growth and money and finance. And so it's critical. The question, which I suppose you've laid out, is how. And this is a really difficult one. And I think, if we had the answer, we would have done it by now. And this is the challenge that I hope Te Tātaki Tāwhiri throws at not just council, but business and communities to go, we can't just carry on doing what we're doing. And I kind of frame it in terms of, our response needs to be inward, outward, and upward. Each one of us needs to look at what we're involved in and say inwardly. So for me, at council, are we doing things right? We're doing some good stuff, but we can do things a hell of a lot better. We need to look outward at our communities and say, how engaged are you? Do you understand what we're looking to do? Do you understand the processes we're going through? And then we need to go upward, and we need to go to government, to those powers that have more power than us. You need to do this for us because we can't do this alone. So I think it's that kind of change that we have tried to articulate within this climate plan.
Thank you. Any further? Yes, thanks, Johnnie.
Yeah, just to bounce off Alec, and I had the pleasure to meet with Kate Raworth in London last year when I was at a Commonwealth Secretariat, hui around climate, and was there on behalf of Mana Whenua. And so when I sort of first looked at the donut when she was talking, and in my reimagining, the donut represented Ranginui on the outside and Papatunuku on the inside. And so that's led to some work and some discussions because, and then there has been some work on a translation of the donut into te reo, which the Donut Action Lab is sort of shared and is sort of making its way through through the online sort of conversation. So, and for me, it's thinking of, and one of the key platforms from the Mana Whenua perspective that's in Te Taruki a Tāwhiri is around the shift to regenerative economy with kaitiakitanga at the centre. And so part of that is sort of reframing and reimagining. And for us, again, maybe looking at a binocular donut, because certainly the donut thinking is from that Western worldview. And what we're not looking at is superimposing some Māori word, so it's really about, I think, a real opportunity to actually take all that thinking and knowledge from across the world, and how do we indigenise it and locate it within Aotearoa and Tāmaki Makaurau context. And I think that's the important part, is that calibration to place. And certainly in the conversations with the council team, because we're really advocating for shift to regenerative economy at the priority. Because if we can get that right, it's that system shift, because sort of reduction and adaptation
sort of playing around at the edges in some ways, and it advocates for incremental, whereas like COVID, we need to have a COVID response in terms of that, in the way that communities and people rallied when something was really important. And so we've got to sort of take that mentality to pivot and think about, I don't know, maybe a kumara or whatever, you know, in terms of making it relevant to our space. So some real awesome opportunities, I think, in terms of the global connections and to people like, and because also the Aotearoa circle, if you like, you know, because what we're seeing is this Western shift from square to circle. That's what's exciting, is we're witnessing a shift. And circle systems thinking is where it's at, because then we can partner with our spiral takarangi systems of Indigenous thinking, because then you're getting circles to hongi. The biggest challenge from a circle view is that we this enforce hongi off a square. It doesn't work, you know, and I think it's for all of us as humanity. And in that long-term shift, it's a return to all our indigeneity, because in our thinking, we all descend from Rangi and Papa. It's not just Māori that, you know. So again, it's the systems lens and what system that, you know. So that's really exciting in terms of other places that are really shifting to that circular way of thinking.
I'll just add a little bit and kind of maybe flip the thinking a little bit even more here, and to not move away from regenerative economy, but make regenerative environments the centre of the discussion. On an individual level, on a whānau level, on a business level, on a government level, how does every single action that we take regenerate the environment? Whether that is within the economy or outside of the economy, it needs to be the front and centre in every single action that us as individuals or collective do in the way that we are going to tackle climate change. The second thing that I want to point out within this discussion is that Indigenous knowledge, again, is very important here, but I think what I want to share within that is that our atua Māori are literal personifications of our taiao, of our environment. We idolise them. They are who guide our way of being, who guide our way of doing. At the moment, the way that we're acting is that they are beneath us. And so there needs to be a complete shift in how we engage with the environment to actually put them above us and to give back and to, like Johnnie said, take that wahine woman approach to nurturing and caring, knowing that that's exactly what the environment has been doing for us since the beginning of time. So I agree with Johnnie in terms of that wahine leadership. We saw the benefits within the response to COVID. All the countries that did well during COVID, all their leadership was women. And it's not surprising, when you put care and love in at the forefront, it's going to result in the change that is most beneficial to all of us. So, yeah, tēnā tātou.
Thank you. Now, I've got lots of questions here about the council, but I don't want to get to the council yet. I want to talk about our responsibility as citizens to get involved. And therefore, thus energised and empowered, we will be more constructive partners and more demanding partners on council. So just kind of free association, if you like, across the panel about some of the exciting examples you see of individuals or groups acting that give us a taste of how that sort of grassroots, that flax roots response to this might work. How would you encourage that individual and collective response?
Even though it wasn't a council question, but you
are an individual too. So
I am.
All right.
I guess talk about individual response, but for me, I think one of the big fundamentals was, and I know we've tried to not make it a generational divide in this discussion, but what I found had the most impact on the councillors and IMSB members around the table, for the first time I feel on any issue, was the rangatahi and the young people and the school strike for climate and parakori and everyone coming in, Generation Zero. The change, the phenomenal change I've seen from, I wanted to be an elected member when I was younger because there was no one younger and talking about the future. And then watching the unitary plan debate when, the founders of Generation Zero sat there and got booed by committee members, people in the audience, for simply saying we'd like somewhere to live in Tāmaki one day. And that was about, that was the level. And then to see this time, many of us marching in the streets with lots of rangatahi, to hear the waiata and the mihi from our rangatahi rōpū and the people working with Te Huia, and actually hearing young people put pressure on the people around the table in a way that told the story of the future and the decisions that we are privileged enough to be making. And for me, it was really that telling to see unanimous support every time the last year or so, from the climate emergency to the passing of Te Tarakia Tāwhiri. And I really, really do think it was the kind of that gut punch of young people saying, stop making these poor decisions for our future just because you're waiting for the next election. And I think that, for me, was the real groundswell. All ages were involved, but I think I feel the change over the last 10 years of respect for that younger voice has been a big part of the climate change, the change for everyone thinking about it. So, yeah.
Building on that, I have seen so much action. I know there's a bunch of us in the room who've been doing this stuff for our lifetimes, but the movement is seriously growing. Even since COVID, I do hear that there's this crazy idea that some businesses, for example, that's the space I work in, don't believe that they should be acting in this space right now. Well, that is not what I'm seeing. What I'm seeing is completely different. There's a lot of individual action out there of people like us. You see our fancy bikes parked behind us. I know there's a lot of people in the room who ride their bikes as passionate individuals doing this stuff. So that's all wonderful. People are going plastic free. That's all fantastic. But then I see businesses in regions around New Zealand who are coming together and go, right, we're in Nelson, let's come together and let's lead the whole nation on how to be climate wonderful, climate regenerative. And they are mainly women-led, so the Chia sisters are doing it down there, but they're pulling together a really good cross-section of small and medium-sized businesses who are acting on climate. And they don't necessarily have support of their council, they just want to do it because they know it's really important, because they know it's an intergenerational thing, but they're my age and some of them are older and they're really passionate about this and they're getting cracking. So I see the action has really picked up. What's challenging is the system doesn't support them, and without being critical too much, it's really hard to work with councils and it's really hard to work with government. So there's these artificial barriers, and actually we all give a shit about this, so we all want to play. How do we change that? So we all get to play together, because at the moment it isn't about who's better, whose logo's bigger, whose ego's bigger. It's about speed, regeneration and pace. Just got to get cracking together, holding hands.
I think that actually... Oh, sorry. Tahui, after you. No, go first.
Just going to build off what Richard said about that rangatahi empowerment coming through. It's very much a reflection of the movements that have come before us and the hard work that has happened before us. Ngā Tamatoa, the Kura Kaupapa Māori movements, they paved the way for us to be able to move into this space confidently. And they did all that hard fight, the grind, the law cases, all that kind of thing, for us to then be able to move and just to speak their kaupapa and to speak what they wanted to see. So it's not a rangatahi movement, it is the building of generations and generations to get through grassroots initiative without the help of councils and government, just people going out and doing what they needed to do to then provide a platform for now rangatahi, not just Māori, but all they have a much better understanding of what it means and the importance of a Māori voice and the importance of that Māori voice in this climate change discussion. So, yeah.
Sorry, Rod. I'm going to just jump because I think we can often get paralysed by this challenge. We go, crikey, that's halving our emissions. Those charts are scary. In terms of what we've got to do, the scale of change from our kind of currently fossil fuel dominated fleet to electric, or just changing the way we move around is big. But the thing is, things have been happening. And I think what I'd love to do on the back of this is to say, look, what is happening? What else is going on? Because, we've often framed climate change as this thing that's 30 years, 40 years, 50 years in advance. The impacts of climate change are here and now. We've seen it in the droughts. We've seen it in the storms. It's here. The transition to a low emissions, zero emissions is already happening. If we think that this is something we plan for in the future, we're sadly wrong. And businesses get that, or the progressive businesses get that. It's coming through in terms of risk. It's coming through. Interestingly, I had a conversation with someone about electric vehicle supply chains. And effectively, so those countries that are saying we don't want, ICE in combustion engine vehicles from this date, the electric vehicle manufacturers are orientating their supply chains towards those countries, not towards New Zealand. So we're already disadvantaged, and we'll be even more disadvantaged if we don't make these policy decisions, make these shifts. That transition is not something that we're looking 5-10 years away. That is something we're deeply in the middle of right now.
And sorry, Rod, electric vehicles, cars, are not the only solution. They are still a barrier in terms of accessibility and affordability, right? I think one of the things that's completely mental about most of us actually is the amount of stuff we own, including cars, when we actually don't need to own. Like, if we can get rid of this addiction of ownership, we're somehow more successful if we've got a fancy car, a fancy house, whatever else you need to make yourself feel really amazing. If we can get rid of that, wouldn't that be amazing? If we actually valued interactions with people, if we really, like I spent today cycling around with the Waiheke Resources Trust folks, looking at the regeneration of our wetlands. And the scale and pace of regeneration is really lifted because Jobs for Nature, which is a government, I think we should have been focused on, shovel-ready project, is actually getting out there, employing people to work in nature. And they were once employed in cafes, and now they're planting into the soil, and they're connecting with their places and caring about it in a way they never would have before. I'd say one of those, that's a really impactful piece of work that we're doing in an urban setting. And I'd like to see more of that, growing more of that.
Just picking up on the transport one briefly as a comment, the work of Paul Winton on his website 1.5 and the work that he's done with MR Cagney on transport shows that Auckland, we just cannot reduce transport emissions anywhere near enough, even with more public transport, even with electric buses, even with light rail, even with electric vehicles. There has to be a huge change in mode of transport, so much more active transport. If you haven't seen his work, there was a very good piece by Simon Wilson in the Herald last week with reference to Paul's work. I would encourage you to get onto his interactive website so you understand what roles we as individuals have to play in this. But that was my pitch on that. But Alec, you were
I was just going to jump in because Paul's work and Emma Cagney's, which is great, it fundamentally, and this is so appropriate to be here talking about the launch of the climate plan at an Auckland Conversations, which is about urban design and function and form and place. And that's critical to think about. And this is where council has the big levers about where and how we build and what we're building, and making sure we're creating these spaces that allow people to connect, that doesn't disadvantage, because the way we're set up is hugely inequitable in terms of opportunities that aren't where they should be. And so I'm really happy because someone did a study on a 15-minute city, and Onehunga was slap bang in the middle of a place that's 50. I live in Onehunga, by the way, and I was really happy because that's the kind of thing in terms of shifting the way that we live is so critical to delivering on these climate objectives as a city, as an urban centre. This is what we've got to do if we're going to have hope. We need to just not just carry on reducing our transport emissions because we've got electric cars, but actually moving differently, moving our things differently, our people differently, and really thinking about this city form that we have. And someone asked me, where do we think the city? I feel like the city is this teenager, going through a potential change. It's like, where do we want to go? And it's up to each and every one of us to help the city get to grow into the city that we want it to be. And we have an opportunity now, really driven by a climate response, really driven by lessons from COVID. And I feel this great momentum in the next year, after a bit of a break, in 2021, where we really need to push hard on growing the city up.
Yes. Oh dear, very challenging concept that Auckland is a teenager. So climate change and puberty, we've got to negotiate at the same time. Yes, absolutely. Look, just reminding you, I'm very keen for some questions from you all, if you have them. And we've got one lady there with a microphone, and another at the back. Just put up your hands and flag them down, and I'll be looking for them. To then ask a question. Look, some particular questions. And this now comes right back to the council itself. When will the council be required to put all its investment decisions through climate change assessments to stop carbon-hungry outcomes?
Well, the climate emergency basically kicked that off. We're still in the, I guess, adolescent stage of that, because it is a big shift from the square thinking to the circle thinking for council. But I must say, it might not be visible to everyone, but having climate change impact assessments on every single decision, and thankfully for our deputy chair, Pipakum, who picks on every single, if it's not done properly or it's not very clear of what the impact is, Pippa will pick it up first. But I think the CCOs are actually doing a big, fantastic job of following that up and acting on it in all the different departments of council. The problem is that it doesn't change the decisions we've already made. And so that's going to be the big sticking point, I think, from next year. It's how do we go back and change those ways we're stuck, the way we're growing, the way the unitary plan is set, all those things. So we can go forward each decision and consider climate very carefully and understand if we're increasing or reducing our emissions and planning correctly, and that's fantastic. But we still have a long way to go because of all the entrenched thinking, the way we build things, the way that we just assume, or parts of the organisation assume we have to keep doing the things the same way. So it takes all of us, but us around the table. I know that local boards and everyone has started picking up on making sure that every decision is considering it genuinely. But it is a big job for the staff and the organisation to be picking that up and really genuinely measuring what those. It just can't happen like that. But I think we're definitely on our way, and Te Tariki Tāwhiri has shown that people have to respond to it. So now we're asking, why aren't you considering the plan? Why aren't you putting the plan through everything you're doing? So it's not quick. It's quicker than maybe I thought would happen in some sections of council, but it's much, much slower in others. So we just have to keep demanding that and keep everyone on their toes, because
but there's going to be specific reporting from the council on its investments and its impacts against this plan. Sorry, that's a question. There is going to be that.
Yeah, there is specific reporting already, and we've also I think of First Council that have just put out our climate disclosures to do that. I think about 2 years earlier than the Climate Commission will probably compel every council to do so. So it's not showing a great picture of what we're doing, and it's clear the Auditor General was. I asked a question about, are we actually acting within the law? And we are looking more into the law. And the Auditor General's, the office has said that the words are great, but the actions need to come, and they need to come faster than probably what we're expecting. I don't know if, Alec, if you have any more to add to that, but.
I mean, only insofar as to reinforce, I mentioned an inward look, and that is really important. And it is about maturity here, where you could intuitively go, I'm building X, so what are the emissions associated with this building X? And you could do that. But the follow-on question is, what's that building being used for? What is that doing? And so there are these subsequent questions that aren't necessarily asked, and this is, the work that we as a team, it's great, we've landed the plan, we kind of need to get it working, and that's one of the big focuses that I see for us, is to help the organisation, because you know, I know businesses, lots of businesses have been doing it for a while. Council hasn't, and has a diversity of decisions as it makes and policies. So we've got to, you know, and it's not about inventing our own systems. It's leveraging off what others have done.
Can I just check with you, Alec? Because as an outsider, when a government calls an emergency, you would imagine that they feel urgent about your emergency. And so you would get together, and it's easier in business because I know it's not a democratic process, so you have much more of a dictator-type model. Not that I'm saying we should get a dictatorship, unless, of course, you know, Pippa leads it. But I think that if you're genuinely saying there's an emergency, you'd be acting in a really different way. And I guess that's what is frustrating as an outsider, because you're looking in and you're seeing what feels like the same process that's been running all the way through my career. It's really hard for business who have great solutions. For example, Zilch, EV car share. Imagine if the council went, we don't need to own the vehicles that we have in our council fleet. We're going to make all of those electric vehicles, we're going to reduce the number, and then at the end of the day, the public, our ratepayers, they can use this fleet. You know, there's got to be some innovation, but there has to be some change in thinking. And if we're thinking this is an emergency, those are the kinds of things that we have to give ear to. Because at the moment, we're still tweaking at the edges. We're not listening to the whenua. We're not listening to our young people. This is just mental. And it's got to change faster.
Thanks. Thank you. Matty, here comes a microphone.
Alex, sorry if this sounds negative, but could you explain to me how it's possible that last month 26 trees were felled in a beautiful stand of bush at Sandspit? They were 200-year-old kauri. 26 of them. The council actually said no to the developer's application. Can't do it. Somehow or other, the developer went back and council said yes. How is that possible? When the council has, I'm sorry to put you on the spot. I don't expect you to know immediately what the reason was. I just raise it as a sharp end of this discussion. It's, to me, as an outsider, using Rachel's terminology, it is incomprehensible how a council that takes climate change seriously could allow that to happen.
So probably more of a political answer maybe than Alec answering, but the general tree protection is the biggest barrier. The removal of that by the government several years ago, and myself and the Mayor have written a number of times to the Minister last term, and again, no, we haven't written to the new Minister, but actually I spoke to David Parker as the Minister on election night about this issue again, and the excuse I think that was used last term was that New Zealand first, etc. But the general tree protection means that council does not have power. We do not have power to stop people cutting down trees, even Cody of that fact. If there are scheduled trees, but they can still get resource consent and pretty easily get those cut down, because general tree protection under the RMA protected those trees, and now we don't have that protection. So we've had many heartbreaking discussions and on this. We're building as a council or planting an urban ngāhere across the council and across the city, and we're barely keeping at the same level of the trees that are being removed. So trees on council property is 60 hectares in the last 7 years increase, and we've had about that same amount removed from private land. So the letters to David Parker would help. They said it's going to be part of this RMA review. Whether they put full tree protection back in, I'm not sure. I know that Pippa and I have also discussed with Chloe Swarbrick to put pressure on from that angle as well. So that has been the biggest The council opposed the removal of the tree protection rules about how many years ago was it, Pippa? 5 years, 6 years? Yeah. So it's caused massive issues across Tamaki Makaurau, and we don't have a really good answer for what we can do about it as a council with the RMA.
Much for that. Just a suggestion, if you want people behind you, use conversations like this to put up there the barriers, and particularly the barriers that you face with central government. For all these people in the room here, I don't know how many people knew that, but we're here to help you and to put, air under your wings, so use us.
Kia ora, thank you.
Yeah. Mobilise us. Or we'll mobilise you. Sorry, that was just a pitch for non-violent civil disobedience, which is recently been endorsed by Jonathan Porritt and Christiana Figueres, so it's all good. I'm all for it. I'm digging a deep hole. This is good. One last question. It's a question about the architecture of where the climate plan fits when council next looks at revising the unitary plan, for example. Does this have preeminence, or does it just jostle alongside in those discussions?
Look, I think there's a couple of things to note on that. One is that we are looking at the unitary plan. So in the emergency budget, so the budget for 2020, 2021 that was passed, there's a project to look at what does the unitary plan mean with a climate lens on. So of course, and this goes back to my earlier point, and actually the point that was raised, council does make incongruous decisions. It's doing certain things that you would go, hang on, doesn't that add to our emissions either directly or indirectly, or does that, and there's a huge amount of work that we've got to do to try and reconcile that. And as I said, that's kind of, falls on my shoulders, but others in the organisation to try and make that work. Unitary plan is one of those. So without a doubt, we've got to look at it. The other thing I'd throw in, and again, what happens to the RMA is going to be really interesting. So literally looking at the results of the review that happened before, and again, what does central government look at in terms of, following on from their climate emergency? What is the policy? What's the change that's going to happen? We know about, the kind of the inundation and sorry, Sarah, I'm going to completely hash this about exactly what it's called, but managed retreat, that's the word I was looking for, act that we've got coming through, and then we have this provision to allow us to think about emissions associated with developments and so on. So without a doubt, unitary plan and the Resource Management Act need to be reviewed. We'll be doing some of that ourselves, and we'll also be looking to try and influence government through what they're doing.
Right, thank you. Rachel.
Sorry, back to this thing about urgency. I think what we learnt with COVID was a strategy, and one of the best comm strategies I've ever seen on how you act together as a society. I mean, admittedly, there were a few outliers, but the numbers weren't that big, right? But imagine if we did that same style of leadership on climate that we did on COVID, and we used science as a front runner. And we looked at that, we looked at things like the soil, we looked at things like temperature, we did those things, and we informed on time, real time, across the city on climate. So every single one of us could see the outcomes of the actions we were taking. We could do that if we wanted to, right? We could also create a way that we include everybody. So it doesn't feel like council or government have to lead this. Frankly, they don't. They never have. It's led by community, and it's led by the really progressive business community. Councils tend to follow. That's the result of a democracy in my world. But imagine if you could be really clear and embrace and create roles for everyone. Really important. That we get those regular updates on how we're going as a nation. We're a bloody small island at the bottom of the world, and we could be leading this stuff, and we should be leading this stuff, my word. And then clear actions on the things you can do. At the moment, we fight with each other about the actions we take, which is just crazy. There's a whole range of different actions that we can all be taking, and most of them are great. Not all of them, like cutting down trees. But the other one is that we should be doing this as a collab, and there will be leaders out there who come up with wonderful new ways of doing things. We need to be seeing those and embracing them much faster. In my time, we've been talking about working from home forever. And then we had to get COVID to give us permission to learn to work from home. We've all learnt that now. Let's not go back to those crazy habits that we're all slipping back into as I watch the motorways start to grow again. These are all things that we know how to do now. We just need to do it. And we just need to feel motivated enough. And you guys are not on your own. You have a community out there that's saying they genuinely care. You probably have a few folks who pull the handbrake on it, but that is not your community. I really believe that is not your community.
Just to echo Rachel, the vision of this plan is really, and council's facilitated, it's brought community business together to do this, but it's like a navigation chart, right? It says this is where we need to get to. We need to get to 50% by 2030, net zero by 2050. Here are the 8 areas that we think collectively we need to act on, and here are those actions. And it's not about we will own every single one, and what we've tried to highlight is that we can't, and we're not best placed in many of those areas to do that. And so I would really encourage people to dive into that plan, to really look at those actions, look at those priorities and go, well, yeah, this is something we're already doing, which a lot of them are, as I said. And this is how we accelerate and amplify. And that's the big thing. I know Pip has talked about this before, about how do we accelerate that action. Action is happening already. We need to accelerate it. So I think that's critical in terms of using this plan well.
Thank you. And I'm just going to ask one important thing about the plan, because names have mana, names have meaning. So wonderful question here on Slido. The name of the Te Reo name of this plan means?
So, Te Tarukia Tāwhiri is not a translation of Auckland Climate Plan. No. And if anything, it's the underpinning values, philosophy, thinking and practice that anchors the plan. And so there's 2 elements. So Taruke has sort of 2 meanings. One is, and we've got 2 narratives that led to this name, and actually fit really well in terms of the context of the plan. So Te Taruke means frustration. Te Tarukia Tāwhiri is we're experiencing the frustration of Tāwhiri Mātia, who's one of our primary ancestors that look after climate. And so significant weather events and all those sort of things is that acknowledgement relationship to climate. And Rachel's point earlier around humans have stuffed up the system, and now nature is responding. Our primal ancestors, Papa Tunuku, are now turning around to say to humanity that, hey, you haven't operated in an appropriate way in honouring your ancestors and honouring your environment. So the environment now is responding and reflecting its frustration. COVID's another manifestation from Papa Tunuku, but more of an accelerated, succinct type of reminder. And so if we're not heeding the voice of our primal parents, to look to restore balance and harmony, the targets are really important, and we saw a bit of that within our lockdown. So when we experienced our first lockdown, it was one of the first times since the Ice Age that Arahi happened to happen on humanity. In our human arrogance, we're the ones that put a rahui or a thing around nature or a marine reserve. But what we witnessed was, and why these targets are important, is that it enables to a point of breathing space for Papa Tunuku to regenerate herself. Because the emergency isn't with nature, it's with us. It's our emergency of our future, not because if we weren't here, Papa Tunuku will regenerate itself. She existed millions of years before we arrived. So in our arrogance, why are we the ones to try and heal? It's the other way around. And so what we're witnessing and experiencing is the frustration of our primal parents in our behaviour. So that's one aspect of Te Taruke. The other aspect is a taruke is a name for a woven crayfish pot. And that acts as a framework. And that came out of a narrative of one of our Ngāti Whātua members. And there's a place up north called Te Taruki in terms of Whangaroa Harbour if you sort of head towards further north. And so he sat in it, and there's a natural part in the beach where there's a natural taruki where at high tide the crayfish come in, at low tide the water goes out, and then they just walk out and get the crayfish. This has been connected to nature and understanding those cycles. So, but he saw this elderly woman weave a crayfish pot. And so the concept of the plan being this framework where those elements sit together in terms of a plan of action and an invitation to action. So that sort of te taruki a tāwhiri just provides that narrative to help locate us to this location, to sort of bring that certain worldview in seeing things that often are hidden in plain sight anyway. And so I think one of the biggest challenges coming out of COVID and in that systems is we need to recalibrate our relationship with time. So we're locked in hamster wheel chronological time, tick, tick time, and we can't sort of resolve some of these issues in that way. We have to evoke what we call more circle time. Our Māori term is te wā, the Pacific term is le wā, and even the Greeks have two terms for time, chronos and kairos. And so what we're talking about is this kairos moments of time where actually we had to recalibrate to nature because we were locked at home. So COVID created this window in time in order to us to, because that's our biggest challenge. Community time versus council time. That's the issue at the end of the day. And until we start to recalibrate and locate ourselves in terms of being in time with nature, then that's where we can really start working together in that sense. So at a whānau level, and I'd call it a catchment level, using what are catchments in terms of community, and then there's a system level work. So the issue of the trees on the whenua, because of the RMA deficiency, there's a system, so some of the council stuff is a systems issue, but we need these 3 points of action at a whānau level, at a catchment level, because water brings us all together. And one of those things, certainly around this emergency budget, is our presentation to the Mayor was you need to use COVID to permit yourselves to reprioritise, because in a way the emergency budget is a bit of BAU trying to stretch into the climate, whereas this is the bold stuff of if we were to reprioritise, like in a COVID sense, from our view, and what we suggested is water should be at the heart. And ironically, this was in the middle of a water crisis when we were having a conversation around this. So water's at the heart, nature wrapped around that in terms of climate, poverty and equity. That becomes really simple when we think about what are our priorities as opposed to going through a budgeting process to try and satisfy a whole lot of things. So I think the emergency declaration, language is really important for me. And sometimes if we're always in a state of emergency, how do we replenish ourselves? And as part of COVID, we've already become COVID fatigue. And I don't know whether Auckland or anyone will do another lockdown, because this is the issue of time. And we're all hoping to the end of the year in 2021 is going to be better, but COVID's not going away. So those are those things about recalibrating our thinking and relationships. So in terms of te taruki a tāwhiri, responding to the frustrations of nature and this framework of well-being in terms of that. So
thank you. Those are very powerful enjoinders to us to go out and engage in that deep way, individually as families and collectively. So thank you for that. I want to thank Tahuia and Johnny and Rachel and Richard and Alec. A big hand for them, please, for your contribution.